Hello, and welcome to Pod of the Week, a place where I get to share my thoughts on pods I think you need to know about. And in continuing with stories or podcasts on the African continent, I want to invite you to listen to a Sonic Feast. I call it a Sonic Feast because it's a podcast centered around something I love. It's something I'm passionate about and something I'm involved in, and it's around music, particularly music from the African continent. And this podcast is a treat. It is an absolute treat. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to invite you to listen to Afroloops. Yes, Afroloops. Now, this podcast centers around Africa. It centers around different instruments from the African continent, its origin story, how it's used in society, the mythical nature about it. I guess I would frame it that way. But just a feast. Yeah, it's a feast for the mind, a feast for the ears, because you get to learn about history. You get to hear the actual instrument and see how beautiful it is and how it's applied in music. So it's absolutely fantastic. So this podcast is curated by the International Library of Music, and in connection with Rhodes University. It is well curated, well thought through, well researched, and it is a sonic feast because it is actually put together so nicely. So if you want to know what it sounds like, have a listen.
Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of Afroloops, the podcast where we discover the instruments of Africa. My name is Tamsin Hanslow, and for this podcast, I am not going to introduce to you an actual instrument, but to the International Library of African Music and one of its earliest recordings. At a time when traditional African music was quickly disappearing and the African scales were being replaced by the Western scale, Hugh Tracy founded the International Library of African Music, which is usually called by its initials, ILAM, in Grahamstown, South Africa, in 1954. The idea was to preserve and promote African music. Hugh Tracy was born in 1903 into a large English family. When he was about 5 years old, his father died. Without that income, the family could not afford to send Hugh to university like his other siblings. In 1920, he was shipped out to Africa to work on his older brother's tobacco farm in South Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. When he got there, he was immediately fascinated by the songs he heard the African farm workers singing. He began to learn these songs, and his interest quickly spread to other African music and musical instruments.
So if you're looking for a podcast that is perfect as a resource to educate people about music on the African continent and instruments from the African continent, as well as a resource for history, but also just something to listen to and something to engage and just enrich yourself, a sonic feast for the mind and the ears, then this is the podcast for you. So remember, podcasts are not for some, they're for everyone.